Thank you so much, Lauren, for that lovely introduction and for bringing us to Chicago. And I'm delighted to be here. And I'm also really looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have after this. I love that the University of Chicago has a social science tea room. Like, I just wish we had a tea room at the University of Michigan. Something called a tea room.
Don't feel bad. I went to it when I was a graduate student. It was awful.
Okay, so just the idea of the social science tea room is appealing to me. So, the piece I'm going to read for you this afternoon is a piece I wrote and performed for the Moth main stage. And the Moth main stage asked me about a year ago to they were doing a series of shows in Michigan, and they wanted me to tell a story, and of course they had a story in mind. You know, I pitch all these stories to them, these ideas that I have. Well, you're going, and no, they actually had a story in mind, and the story was the story of the NEA, and I'm like, you know, it's like, am I ever going to escape this story and my notoriety as the NEA, one of the NEA 4, or Karen Finley and the Free Homosexuals, who were unfortunately known, which made me really understand what that moment of shift, what it must have been for the other women who went from being the Supremes to being Diana Ross and the Supremes. Even though you were Supreme, you didn't have a name. And I thought, I had already done a solo show about my experience with the NEA, and I had spent a lot of time with this story, and telling the story numerous times, and my story of the NEA was a story of a failure to tell a story. A story of a failure to tell a story that was convincing either in a soundbite format. You were asked to perform in different ways. Perform your story of how this personally affected you in some way and suddenly the stakes are high, and you have to sort of tell something that's going to be, moving and upsetting enough that people will forget that you're, a big dyke who got, federal money, tax money, and will sort of pull at the heartstrings in some sort of Hallmark kind of way. And I could never really do that. Or if you did that, then, and you kept it trapped in a personal frame, right? It was falling out of a larger political context, of which there were many different stories of other kinds of censorship, whether we're talking about the kind of censorship that was happening around AIDS education and around experience of AIDS, or talking about attacks on hip-hop and movie ratings at the same time, all these other kinds of stories. So I'd already lived with a failure to tell this story in some way that felt like the story was settled. So this is another attempt to do this. And I kept, and then they were saying, and fold it into your whole life, and let's do it in under 10 minutes, okay? The other thing is I was working on it with somebody from the Moth, and it's a fascinating thing about the Moth because it has this, I hope there's no one from the Moth, never worked there again, which maybe it's just as well. But because it has this whole veneer of informality and people just getting up and pulling something out of their ass that's fully formed and funny and moving and shaped and has some sort of moment that grabs you right at the opening, and then some sort of closure, it has a narrative arc, and it just like comes fully formed from some orifice of your body. But of course, that's not what really happens, and you know, you're coached and you're shaped. So I'm working on this NEA story with this really lovely person from the Moth, but I have to perform it for the executive producer of the Moth a couple of days before it's presented in Michigan, and they're sitting there, and it's like a terrible audition experience for anybody who's auditioned, where you're just like, you're doing it, and there's these like, you know, it's like for the Easter Island hens. So they're just like, they have no body, they're these big heads, you don't know how they got there. They look vaguely, you know, human, but not the way you would represent it, and they're just like, you know, you're not grabbing them, nothing is happening, you're dying inside. And then afterwards they're like, you can't tell this story, we get NEA funding. It's like, you cannot say that the NEA censored you because we get NEA funding. And I was like, well, you know, actually I really didn't want to do this story. Other things have happened to me, or I've observed other things, but now I can't not do this and somehow, you know, tell the story of being one of the NEA4 and then miss somehow the censorship part. I mean, I don't know what other part there was. Anyways, that's kind of, so it's an so this is part of my attempt to tell the story and find a story that I told many different ways from a new point of entry. And also, I thought it might be interesting to do here because it's trying to like identify myself as a person from the Midwest and my adventure in New York. So I moved from Michigan, where I was born and more importantly reared, to New York City in 1979 to become an artist. And I was just out of college, Kalamazoo College, and well, I was not really just right out of college. There were those couple of years, but I don't think they count because, you know, they don't show up on any resume, right? The invisible years spent waiting tables and, you know, dusting plants and just generally waiting for somebody to tell me what's going to happen next. Right? Because I was a really good student, which means I was really good at doing what other people told me to do, at sort of delivering what other people wanted me to do and a little bit more. But now that I could go anywhere, do anything, it was just too much. Or at least I thought I could go anywhere, do anything. But the prospect was too much for me. It was like the sky in this part of the country in August. I mean, it's big, it's beautiful, but there's just too much of it. Right? I mean, there's no mountains that can break the sky into pieces that you can manage, and that's why people complain about the flatness of the Midwest, right? Because there's more sky than we know what to do with. So in 1979, I land in New York with a little suitcase and a black cat, and I head to the New York Feminist Art Institute, which was this group, this school founded in the edges of Soho, which was not quite completely converted into a mall at that point, by a group of feminist artists who volunteered. I'm still thinking about this. They volunteered to teach several days a week because they thought the next step in their feminist activism was pedagogical, that they had to commit to training another generation of feminist artists. Of course, I arrive in that moment in feminism where the sort of like wind had gone out of the sails, and I get there and I have this image of sisterhood that's formed by the Pointer Sisters and Sister Sledge and We Are Family, and I see it as like sort of literal, and that we're going to collectively erect, pardon the expression, soft sculpture vaginas and toss them around, and that will bring the military-industrial complex to a halt. And some of the students that arrived with me like changed their name, which was a practice of the time. Like this one woman changes, she feels so free in Manhattan. Most of us are from other parts of the country, we don't feel so free. But she changes her name to Very Free Woman. But the sisters had stopped speaking to each other by the time I had arrived. I didn't know that. In 1979, it's hard to imagine how cool this was, in a sense, at that time. Because coolness in 1979 was kind of orange shag. Orange was seen as an earth color. Shag was seen as almost an earth substance. Fondue, it was kind of a health food. People remember that fondue and quiche were kind of health foods. And feminism. And the first coming of John Travolta. And there were all these like quasi-feminist songs on the radio that you could kind of dance to. And I remember like my last job before I left Michigan, working at the Red Lobster in East Lansing, and how the night manager, a man, would sing "I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar" when he balanced the register at night. So, I show up at the New York Feminist Art Institute not knowing what had happened to feminism, that I kind of missed the moment. And I'd come with about 2 dozen other women who came from really all over the world to an art school that did not have even a table or a chair or a clamp lamp. It was a series of empty rooms. And empty except for the people who'd left everything behind. You need stuff to make art. I don't care what I don't care if you're a conceptual or a theoretical-based artist. You need to sit down in a chair and think up some stuff. But I learned my first important New York lesson at that moment. There were a couple of native New Yorkers in our group, and they shepherded us all out to the dumpsters. And as we're going out to the dumpsters, I feel like this is the moment, this is exactly what our mothers warned us about. All of our mothers, regardless of class or region that we came from, that, if you move to New York, you're going to end up living in a dumpster. But my mother gave me a couple of weeks to arrive at that point. This was like day 2, and I'm already headed out to the trash and dumpster diving, because what we have in common, I think, that something that maybe feminism missed as we were trying to think of something that could unite us, is that we were all afraid of trash. We were all afraid of what got thrown out. We come from these aggressively clean places in the world, like Georgia, Kansas, Massachusetts, Michigan, and if something was broken or tired in our family, most of us had attics or basements, not all of us. And in New York, there are people that live in what would be your basement, and they have their own tragic sofas, but everything in New York used to go out on the street, and the dumpsters of New York at that time were an endless yard sale, because you didn't have to buy anything. And I think of this as an important moment in my life, in my artwork, in my political philosophy, of like taking this stuff, this amazing stuff, out of the street, of like holding onto the ankles of these other women as they went into these dumpsters all over Soho and like pulled out stuff, and that's what we were going to make our artwork out of. And we're watching out that no one's coming, and one of the things that's changed about New York is it's really hard to throw out big pieces of furniture. I mean, people just would like somehow muscle sofas and tables and all sorts of stuff out into the street. Now you can't do that. It's part of the ongoing gentrification project. There are people that had, lived for years furnishing their apartments out of stuff that other people threw away, or made entire performance sets out of stuff that people thrown away. It's harder to find. So the New York Feminist Art Institute is kind of collapses, but that's okay because there's lots of other feminist groups in the city and I have to check them out. I feel like I'm rushing sororities, trying to find the right flavor of feminism. And I go to see a performance at a tiny little space called the Wow Cafe in a storefront. And I go to see a play that's a feminist revisioning of Beauty and the Beast. It's not really a play in the way that I understand it. It's like this world that I want to disappear into that rabbit hole. And I feel like what got me into theater and performance was kind of like peer pressure. I got a collective crush on this group of women in this tiny space. They were mostly, as it turned out, feminists who'd been kicked out of other feminist groups for having the wrong haircut, for having the wrong kind of sex, for any other kinds of infractions, or feeling really alienated from the direction that feminism in the early 80s was going in. And I asked this person who I assumed was a woman, although I wasn't really sure because this person looked a lot like James Dean, that I wanted to volunteer backstage. I was a visual artist, and this James Dean said, when do you want to do your show here? And I'm like, no, I'm a visual artist, I work backstage. And she looked around, and there was no backstage. There was just one room. It was all stage. And she said, how about April? So that's what I did. I felt like I couldn't argue with somebody who looked like James Dean. And, in New York, if you don't immediately answer someone's question, they'll just fill in the answer for you. So my first show, I decided to tell the only story that I really had in my mind about like coming out as a lesbian while I was working as a waitress at the Red Lobster, and I thought, I don't know anything about theater or performance. Maybe it's been done. Maybe this is a cliche. Maybe this is the tritest story there is. Homosexuality and fast food. And I thought, what if I tell it from the standpoint of the lobsters? Because I know I can make the lobster costumes. And that is what I did. And it was kind of the perfect transition from art student to artist because it was an assignment from James Dean. And I called the show Shrimp in a Basket. It was a hit. It was a huge hit. It sold out all 3 nights, all 15 seats. But James Dean said, never say how many, just say it's sold out. Don't tell him there's only 15 seats, I learned if you go on the road and you do a show, never come back and say, oh, it was terrible, nobody showed up, or they hated me, I sucked, whatever my lines was great. So, it led to, more shows, 3 nights, 4 nights, 23 seats, and I got reviewed, and I started to have a career, and my life started to feel like, like my life, like a road I wanted to travel. And by that time, it was apparent that I couldn't just keep asking my extremely talented friends to work for free. And the lobster costumes had already crawled back to the dumpsters to spawn and die. And so I started applying for grants. I mean, there was this moment, decades ago, where actually there were some grants that as emerging artists you could apply for, and it was never enough money, but it was some money that emerging artists could get to pay the people they worked with, pay for costumes, pay for lights, maybe document your work, and I started applying for grants. And somehow in the late 80s, late 90s, I decided to go for a National Endowment for the Arts grant. And I was just talking to Eve Patrick about this. We were talking about grants and about grant applications. And one of the things that has changed in the more than 20 years, I would say, since this happened is not that there's just less money. There is dramatically less money that's available for artists at all levels. And the NEA was, I think, in some ways the most democratically minded of all arts organizations, despite what other funding organizations might purport. They were really interested in funding artists in different parts of the country, in serving different demographic groups, and funding underserved artists and audiences. And the grant application was really straightforward, which is not, it's easier to buy a house than it's to apply for these grants that you're never going to get. So, 1990, I applied for a National Endowment for the Arts grant, and in 1990, this is what I think America looks like. The AIDS epidemic just cast this giant shadow over the entire country. And I say this with young people in the room. In 1990, it's 100% fatal. There's no cure. There's not even a treatment. And it is a very bad way to go. It just takes you down to your skin and bones, and then you live there for a while. And I can remember those days in the 80s, in the 90s, of feeling like I'd never seen a human skull before that was attached to a living body. And the whole thing wrapped up in this thin skin that is marked by the unmistakable dark red blotches of a previously rare cancer. It makes queerness, it makes marginalized people visible, and it hits the queer community particularly hard among other communities. If we're not dying, we're helping our friends, and we're using our art to do what the media and the government refuse to do. To mourn, to demand treatment. Instead of attacking the disease in 1990, the Congress decides to go after art. Instead of helping people with AIDS, Congress blames gay people for AIDS, and it passes a law banning the NEA from funding what they call gay art or homoerotic art. And I think, like, what is homoerotic art anyways? I mean, or gay art? Is it art by gay people, art about gay issues? Is it, as we like to joke, paintings that sleep with other paintings? And is banning gay art, homoerotic art really a way to eventually ban all art? Because, let's face it, the arts are kind of notorious. I mean, they're like hairstylists, women's golf. Straight people do these things. Straight people live in San Francisco, as well as others. But even the straight people that live in San Francisco can speak gay well enough to order brunch to say the word AIDS. is amazing. The mail, it used to be things other than like, you know, flyers for things you don't really need, or credit card offers. You got a letter addressed to you that was either yes or no. In 1998, I got a conference call from some lawyers, and the funding was approved by a panel of experts, but then revoked because of pressure. And at that moment, it's not my grant anymore that we're talking about. It's a cause. There's lawsuits brewing, and the next morning I'm on the front page of the New York Times, along with 3 other performance artists. We're on the front page, above the fold, but mostly the New York Times calls us the NEA4, which I like to think of as a really bad cover band that you play your middle school prom. The whole time, I'm thinking there's no such thing as bad publicity, right? Right? Isn't that one of the enduring mantras of American? There's no such thing as bad publicity. And indeed, I do get, as a result of this, an invitation that I had always hoped would arrive, an invitation to go to the 92nd Street Y in Manhattan, which I consider the Grand Ole Opry of American arts and letters. I mean, this is where Toni Morrison reads, Tony Kushner, Tony Danza, all the Tonys are there. I think it's going to be great. I mean, so what if I'm the only woman on the panel? So what if I'm the only gay person? So what if I'm the only person who does not have their own TV talk show? It's going to be fun. My partner Esther is saying, "You're funny. You're funny." Not that I'm blaming her. I'm funny. I am funny. So I go, and the host introduces me, except that he has a hard time saying the word lesbian. Really has a hard time. So there's like this dramatic pause. You can feel it building up inside him, this vast tundra